Sweater weather today, t-shirt weather tomorrow. Welcome to Central Texas. It is so tempting to talk about how big Baldur's Gate 3 is. The world is enormous, packed with plot hooks, richly characterized NPCs, and a staggering number of options for how to play the game. From a mile up, the sheer sprawl of it all would look overwhelming. But you don't really play Baldur's Gate 3 from a mile up. You play firmly grounded in each moment, focused less on the contours of distant mountains than you are on the terrain directly underfoot. So that's what I'm going to talk about here. I don't want to summarize the grand sweep of Baldur's Gate 3 because I don't think that would actually capture what it feels like to play the game. Instead, let's talk about some moments. So, who was I? Faunus, the half-elven bard, got his name from my ancient Dungeons & Dragons character handle. Back in 2002, when I played D&D with my middle school friends, Faunus was a clumsy druid, comic relief for his more traditionally heroic companions. That's also how 12-year-old me played Faunus in the AOL fantasy roleplay chat rooms, blissfully unaware that dozens of adults looking for a very different sort of role-playing experience were hitting on my clumsy druid from log on to log off. But the Faunus of Baldur's Gate 3 was not a druid, because the game already has enough of those. Instead, he was a bard, a city kid with a winning smile and a song in his heart. And he was a real sweetie, always sticking out his neck for the little guy, constantly turning down rewards for his hard work. Astarion hated Faunus. He was curious to learn every story he could, to read every book and to talk the ear off of every NPC, always looking for the lyrical inspiration for his next song. He was probably at his very happiest, geeking out about music with strangers.
I've been experimenting with lute strings made of, hear me out, warg hair.
He spent his adventure cautiously dating his cleric girlfriend, who he was only with because he didn't have the guts to date Orin.
I itch to peel you, to split your skin.
I could fix her. Faunus also completely refused to engage with the Illithid power subsystem, because he was already grossed out enough by having one alien worm wriggling around in his brain, and he didn't need any more worms in there, thank you very much. So that's who I was. Here's what I did. Oh, one quick warning. Some of these moments are completely spoiler-free, and some of them decidedly aren't. I'll give big, bold warnings where applicable, and there'll be chapter markers that you can skip around to, but if you want to completely avoid all spoilers altogether, moments 1, 6, 7, and 8 are the ones to skip. In the world of Dungeons & Dragons, Jinn, or genies if you prefer, are not to be trifled with. Unfortunately for Faunus, he trifled around and found out. It all happened in the Circus of the Last Days, a very not safe for work, not safe for life extravaganza that appeared out of thin air just south of the city of Baldur's Gate. A bleeding ghoul greets you at the entrance with a long sniff. The wild beasts that crave human flesh are kept in old cages with flimsy, rusty locks. The mortality rate for visitors at the Circus of the Last Days is roughly equivalent to huffing anthrax while juggling plutonium bricks. So obviously, Faunus and his friends had to go check it out. After buying some face paints from a literal mummy, Faunus decided to try his luck at the prize wheel, run by a djinn with exceptionally poor people skills.
Approach! Ugly one!
The team cleric, vastly more perceptive than Faunus, immediately noticed that the djinn was cheating, making sure that nobody could win the grand prize. She called the djinn out on his cheating ways and got polymorphed into a wheel of cheese for her trouble. So Faunus stepped up to the prize wheel, eager to finagle a win from the djinn. It required a pretty hefty persuasion check, but that's exactly where Faunus excelled. He was less of a fighter and more of a talker, solving his problems with words instead of blades. And It worked. He distracted the djinn long enough to win the grand prize. What did he win? Well, furious that his rigged game had been beaten, the djinn granted Faunus a special reward. A one-way teleport over 1,200 miles south by southwest, deep into a wild, overgrown jungle stalked by mysterious reptile predators.
Chult! The genie sent Faunus to Chult!
Okay, this warrants a little bit of explaining. Yes, I did play some Dungeons & Dragons when I was in middle school, but not nearly as often as I wanted to. The majority of my experience with D&D came not from playing, but from reading the official source books, absorbing every last scrap of lore down to the dregs, fantasizing about campaigns I would never get a chance to run. One of the locations that caught my attention in those source books was the remote and mysterious jungle of Chult, full of bizarre tropical plants and massive looming dinosaurs. It was one of the first times that I'd seen the role-playing systems of D&D transplanted from Ren Fair medieval aesthetics, and it ignited my curiosity. Enough with the dragons, why not fight a dinosaur? Enough with the mead, why not drink raw sap from a man-sized pitcher plant? I wanted to explore every inch of Chult, but in the back of my mind, I knew I'd never get to play a game set there. Fast forward 2 decades, and holy shit, completely out of left field, as a punishment doled out by an obnoxious djinn at a carnival, there I was, stranded in Chult. I was creeping through the dense tropical brush, sneaking past hungry dinosaurs, exploring the exact same jungle I had dreamt about as a kid after an unexpected transition as invigorating as it was abrupt. When I found a gateway home, replete with the grim set dressing of an adventurer who never learned the fly spell, I knew it was time to return to my companions at the circus, but I lingered for a moment, savoring the completely unexpected thrill of the jungle. Entering the gateway sent Faunus hurtling through space and out of the circus outhouse. I declined to scrutinize the exact mechanics of how that all went down. After a brief pit stop to visit the best merchant in the game...
Don't worry. I only takes junks from dead people. Is nice.
Faunus returned to the gloating djinn, who was clearly hoping he'd ruined everybody's day. But instead of saying something snide or catty, Faunus answered with the honest truth. It was really, really fun. Pretty late in the game, Faunus and co. found themselves undergoing a series of academic trials deep beneath Baldur's Gate. Jurisprudence art puzzles, wizard chess, and so on. On the way to one of the puzzles, Faunus stumbled into a small library alcove wherein fluttered a pesky flying book. As a seasoned dungeon delver and obsessive reader, Faunus knew that the book was obviously important to the puzzle ahead. So he cracked his knuckles, passed the sleight of hand skill check, and voila! Flying book acquired. But then Faunus noticed a second flying book. And this time...
Hold still with him!
He was traveling with the veteran adventurer Jaheira in his party, and Faunus decided to let her give it a try instead. That didn't work.
Goddamn paper cut!
Out of all of his companions, Faunus knew that the rogue Astarion was the best at sleight of hand. But Baldur's Gate 3 doesn't just let you switch out party members whenever you want to. No, Faunus had to schlep all the way back to camp, tell Jaheira to stay put, grab Astarion, and schlep back to the book puzzle. And of course, Astarion managed to grab the book on his first try. But then, there was another flying book.
Thomas! Get down here!
It became clear that everybody got one chance to grab a book, after which, pass or fail, they were locked into failure every time. So Faunus schlepped back to camp again, told Astarion to stay put, grabbed the only guy left without literal brainworms, and Minsk immediately failed. Once again, schlepp back to camp, order Minsk to stay put, tell the wizard to take off his stupid hat, and finally, grab the last book. Only then did Faunus realize, upon actually reading the books, that all 3 of them were books he had already read. At this point, Faunus decided to find an alternative solution to the puzzle. This particular moment was very annoying, but undeniably vivid. The developers at Larian could have included a way to switch out party members on the fly without fast traveling back and forth to camp. And they probably will at some point. It's a highly requested feature by players, a point of real friction. It's part of how the game was made. The developers at Larian originally intended the player to pick a party of 4 and stick with them. And you're not locked into a party of 4 in the actual release of Baldur's Gate 3, but the structural bones of the game feel ill-suited to a party-swapping playstyle. In time, Larian will probably patch that friction out. But I'm glad I got to play the book puzzle while it was still so irritating. For one thing, the inconvenience of it all was tangible, bone-rattling. The little stuttery load every time I left the dungeon and returned gave me a digestible facsimile of hiking to and from camp, the damp, clammy logistics of dungeon exploration briefly triumphing over the many conveniences of modern game design. The irritation also imprinted those evil little books much harder in my memory. If the consequences for failing the sleight of hand check were mere seconds of inconvenience, 1 or 2 clicks, I'd barely even notice it. But every time one of those slippery little leather-bound bastards evaded my grasp, droplets of cave water dripping incessantly in the background, I felt it. And it didn't feel good, but it made for a much more vivid moment. Baldur's Gate 3 is a very horny video game.
Well, you'd be a succulent meal. I would like to have gorged.
Like a very, very horny video game.
Yeah. Good lord.
That's probably appropriate. Just one of the many ways the game faithfully adapts the experience of playing tabletop D&D in 2023.
I'm quite horny, you see.
Nevertheless, the volcanic horniness of Baldur's Gate 3 is so distracting that it ends up being one of the game's most recognizable and distinguishing features. I imagine the omnipresent sexual enthusiasm stems from an unintended consequence of the game's design. Almost every one of your companions is a romance option, so conversation needs to feel flirty, even outright leering, to feel like a conversation that could conceivably light a romantic spark, to telegraph that the door is open for the player to walk through. But 7 open doors is a lot of open doors, and the ludic experience of the early game is that 7 horny strangers are simultaneously trying to wheedle their way into your bedroll. For some, that probably sounds like paradise, but for Faunus, it was extremely awkward. Particularly with Wyll. Turning down each of the romantic advances was a nerve-wracking experience for Faunus. How would his companions react? Would Karlach still affectionately call him soldier? Would Halsin follow him into battle? All were varying shades of awkward, but Wyll presented a singular case. For spoiler reasons that I won't include here, Wyll comes from a pretty cushy background. Cushy enough that it's almost a red flag by itself. As an adventurer, he's given himself a legendary title, the Blade of the Frontiers. And the overall vibe Wyll radiates is that, yes, you would have to call him the Blade of the Frontiers in bed, too. He's modeled his entire personality after an archetype of a traditional male fantasy hero, whether he's willing to admit it or not.
What manner of hero is so shrouded in secrets?
I have never called myself hero.
The hero at heart, 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 the hero at the hero at heart.
I have never called myself hero.
With that in mind, it occurred to Faunus that Wyll might have some entitlement issues. Sadly, Faunus was right. One night at camp, Faunus stumbled into Wyll practicing his ballroom dancing steps. It was cute. But then Wyll, with an air of perfect authority, told Faunus to be his dancing partner. Gently, Faunus declined, but Wyll insisted, pressed the issue.
Are you sure? I've been rehearsing, you know. I'd hate to put all that effort to waste.
At that point, Faunus had to voice a more firm rejection than he would have liked, just to cut through the noise. In the face of that rejection, Wyll reacted like he'd just taken an arrow to the chest. Later on in the adventure, Wyll made some genuinely heroic decisions that won Faunus back over, won me back over. But that night at camp left a terrible taste in my mouth.
It might be the ultimate damnation via faint praise, but I've been told more than a few times in my real life that I'm good at handling rejection. And I try to be. The women I know tell me stories about men who erupt when rejected, seemingly normal guys who morph into frightening menaces the minute they hear the word no. By the standards of the stories I've been told, the companions in Baldur's Gate 3 handle rejection beautifully. But I still felt awful every time.
Rather than listening to stories about rejection, Baldur's Gate 3 gave me an opportunity to roleplay that scenario from a new point of view. A familiar scenario to so many women. The moment when a friend decides unilaterally that you're now more than friends. The moment when you have to puncture somebody's delusions and hope they'll stick around through the aftermath. Even in a fictional space, it was a miserable moment to live through.
Remember, Faunus, the half-elven bard, is a sweetie, and so he does not steal from everyday people. That would be wrong. He doesn't even steal from the moderately wealthy.
It's tough when you can just hit the tab key and reveal all the rare items lying out in the open, but Faunus doesn't steal from decent people, no matter how much he maybe kind of wants to sometimes.
Stealing from the obscenely wealthy, on the other hand? Well, in Baldur's Gate 3, just like in real life, stealing from the obscenely wealthy is, morally speaking, extremely good.
The vault of choice for the obscenely wealthy citizens of Baldur's Gate is the Counting House. Technically, the Counting House is also a bank for common citizens, but their paltry contributions and withdrawals amount to little more than a rounding error. The real value is locked up tight in the high-security vaults. The tantalizing secret diaries of powerful politicians, rare artifacts of wondrous capabilities, towering, teetering stacks of gold. At the particular moment of recording, it also had a lot of blood and viscera on the floor. Long story, don't worry about it. The thing is, Faunus didn't have a lot of experience with theft. He hadn't stockpiled extra potions of invisibility, hadn't learned the ins and outs of sightlines and sneaking. He wanted to crack into those vaults, but he was gonna have to improvise. To begin the heist, Faunus and co. began to inconspicuously snuff out all the lights near the vaults. This did not seem to concern the bank guards. Then, with all the lights snuffed, Faunus began to stage a grand distraction the best way he knew how, with the power of song. Faunus plucked gently away at his lyre, the spider's lyre, as it happens, a tool of art crafted by a death cult, and by the power of a successful performance check, Faunus mesmerized the guards. With the firelight snuffed and the music in full effect, Astarion started work cracking the locks. Unfortunately, the locks in the high-security vault were really strong. Imagine that. So, Shadowheart boosted Astarion's sleight of hand skill, again, very inconspicuously.
I can only assume the guards really liked the song that Faunus was playing.
Snuffed lights, spider's lyre, and a cleric's sacred boost turned out to be the perfect recipe. With nary a single invisibility potion, Astarion cracked all the high-security vaults one by one, robbing the elites of Baldur's Gate for every last gold piece. I won't tell you everything I found in those tasty secret nooks and crannies. You'll have to pull off an ill-conceived heist of your own. But my ill-conceived heist was a perfect success. Oh, and the cherry on top? When Faunus was finished performing, the bank guards gave him a tip.
The fifth vivid moment of Baldur's Gate 3 technically didn't occur while I was playing the video game. Didn't even occur entirely in 2023. You'll see what I mean.
Ketheric Thorm. The big bad villain of Act 2 is a guy named Ketheric Thorm, the husk of an evil warrior held together by complex necromancy and simple spite. I started to get a hunch about Ketheric Thorm when I heard his name, and when I researched him further in his family's ancestral tombs, my hunch was all but confirmed. I learned that Ketheric Thorm was more than 100 years old, that he had already tried to take over the world a century ago, that a band of heroes, including the legendary Jaheira, managed to stop him.
The conclusion seemed pretty obvious to me. Ketheric Thorm was a character from one of the previous Baldur's Gate games.
I've never played Baldur's Gate 1 or 2. I was more of a Planescape Torment guy.
Stupid yabo.
But those games towered over the North American computer RPG genre, behemoths that garnered great acclaim and adoration. That was part of the appeal of the pitch for Baldur's Gate 3, that Larian would pay due homage to a pair of venerated classics while carrying their creative spirit into the modern day. I already knew that a few characters were holdovers from previous games, like Jaheira, and I knew that the previous games were set roughly a century before Baldur's Gate 3. The mental math checked out. Ketheric Thorm's last attempt at world domination would have taken place around the right time, and the numbers didn't lie. More than the timing, though, it was the name. Ketheric Thorm.
That is one turn of the millennium-ass D&D necromancer name if I've ever heard one.
And believe me, I've heard a few. Zarad Duskmarrow, Zingax, Malthorn Jathlet, Sabrak of the Blood, Ghoulmaster.
Who could possibly forget Ghoulmaster?
Jasmarn Shadewidow, Azira Gloomdelve, Sternal Thonok, Wynn Cardzin, Fistathak, Zundra Charmhand.
Believe it or not, I could go on. So, yeah, he's got tragic gravitas and the husky vocal tones of an exhausted J.K. Simmons, but his name is still Ketheric Thorm. I clocked that guy from a mile away. He's a legacy character. Except, no, he isn't.
After I finished Act 2 of the game, I decided to Google Ketheric Thorm to learn about his previous appearances in the series, and there were none. He's new. Larian invented him just for Baldur's Gate 3. Ketheric fucking Thorm is a character concept younger than most cats. I think it's a testament to Larian's refined taste for the nuances of genre flavor that they named their villains so well. That the mouthfeel of Ketheric Thorm summons echoes of the pulpy covers of cheap fantasy books and the tactile sound of dice against wood. Learning that Ketheric Thorm was a Larian original was a startling and vivid moment. And even though it didn't technically occur while the Baldur's Gate 3 executable was running on my PC, it thoroughly belongs to the game.
Faunus was a real sweetie. He cared about people, and he tried his best. Wrong actions? Never heard of him.
Yeah, right. When did we ever did wrong actions? Get real.
A lot of video games reward that kind of behavior unequivocally. If you're nice, or even halfway decent, everybody loves you. But some of the video games that I like best take a more complicated approach.
My first clue that Baldur's Gate 3 would take a more nuanced approach to my good behavior was Astarion. Every time Faunus did anything friendly, Asterian's opinion of him sank like a stone in the river Chionthar. I had to start planning my playthrough around my meaner-spirited companions, leaving them behind at camp before I did anything kind, to make sure they wouldn't bail on me midway through the adventure. But the biggest slap to Faunus's sweet, unsinning face came in Act 3, the game's final act. When he finally arrived at the city of Baldur's Gate, Faunus found a city in the throes of a totalitarian takeover. The city's new autocrat was phasing out human guards, replacing them with the so-called Steel Watch, hulking metal automatons that doled out cruel justice for even the most minor trespasses.
It's a good thing automation in law enforcement isn't a problem in the real world. A very good thing. A very good thing indeed.
Priority 1 for Faunus & Co. was finding a way to disable the Steel Watch, a long and circuitous adventure that eventually led to the foundry where the Steel Watch were manufactured. I'm not going to reveal everything about that foundry. If you want to know the full horror of the internal workings of the Steel Watch, you're gonna have to play the game yourself. Or you could Google it, I guess. The only detail you need to know for this story is that real organic brains suspended in jars were controlling the Steel Watch like enormous metal puppets.
And no, that's not the horrifying part.
Fortunately for Faunus, he had a Mind Flayer brainworm wriggling around in his skull, the exact kind that gave him telepathic access to the brains suspended in those jars. So he decided to step in and play hero. The first brain Faunus connected with was turning away a family of desperate refugees at the border of the city. Without hesitation, Faunus used his worm-based telekinetic powers to take control, to force the Steel Watch to step aside and let the refugees inside the city. A job well done. The next brain was even worse, puppeting a Steel Watch automaton chasing down a citizen who'd committed some minor act of theft. Faunus used his magic worm powers, but nothing happened. The Steel Watch rejected his influence. The citizen was crushed to death underneath an enormous metal boot.
Remember, Faunus didn't embrace his illicit powers. I almost never used the brainworm, so I didn't know it needed a long rest to reset.
Faunus raced to the next brain. This one was chasing down a child. Faunus tried to interfere, but again, it didn't work. His good intentions didn't matter. The child didn't survive. There was no sense interfacing with another brain. There was only one good option, the option Faunus should have chosen at the very beginning. The path he'd regret not taking for the rest of his life.
On a purely aesthetic level, smashing liquid tanks full of experimental matter in an evil industrial facility gave me strong notes of Sephiroth in the flavor profile, and that's always a good taste. But the more substantial impact is that Baldur's Gate 3 denied me the satisfaction of doing a heroic deed. The game fully recognized that I was playing a virtuous character, but it withheld a clean storybook ending. I made the choice to interfere with a broken law enforcement system, but it wasn't enough. I was insufficiently forceful, excessively cautious, and innocent people paid the price, despite my good intentions. Lessons for real life? Maybe? That last moment made Faunus feel harmless, in the worst possible way. At the exact opposite end of that spectrum, you'll find Act 1's Githyanki Kresh.
How to describe the Githyanki? Dungeons & Dragons is chock full of elves, dragons, fairies, and other creatures grounded in centuries of folklore. Common reference points for fiction. But that's not where the Githyanki come from. Instead, the Githyanki were the organic creation of generations of D&D players. The basic concept of a hostile alien race called the Githyanki that had broken the shackles of interstellar enslavement hatched from the mind of George R.R. Martin in the 1970s in a book unrelated to D&D. But D&D's facsimile of outer space, the Astral Plane, was home to evil mind flayers that enslaved mortal species. And some homebrew players wondered, what if the Githyanki were one of those species? And what if they were frog-like with upturned Whoville noses? What if they laid eggs? What if they were hyper-militaristic? And wouldn't it be rad as fuck if they rode red dragons into battle? That brings us to Baldur's Gate 3 and to Lae'zel, a stranded Githyanki soldier with a Mind Flayer brainworm in her skull.
Only the maniacs at Larian would look at Githyanki lore and say, yes, but what if Sundere?
Chuk, you believe you can survive without me?
Early on in the adventure, Lae'zel insisted that her people had a foolproof way to extract brainworms, which sounded pretty good to Faunus. He tracked down the Githyanki Kresh, and it didn't take long to confirm that yes, these were definitely Lae'zel's people. The Githyanki cautiously allowed Faunus and co. entry into the Kresh, where the ever-curious bard was fascinated to witness the social dynamics and cultural practices of a Githyanki community. Harsh militaristic training wasn't a surprise, but not every Githyanki fit the hardcore soldier mold. There were mischievous kids, layabouts, gossiping sentries, a full spectrum of behavior. In order to keep this section of the video relatively spoiler-free, I'm not going to tell you exactly what happened next. I'll only say this. In my playthrough, Lae'zel's personal journey took an unexpected turn. She made a very surprising decision, and she and Faunus became reluctant enemies of the Githyanki people. All of that happened deep within the Kresh, so Faunus mentally prepared himself for a long, arduous battle to escape the Githyanki. But after a short conflict with the strongest soldiers in the whole community, Faunus was surprised to find that the halls of the Kresh were mostly empty. Where life and community had so recently flourished, there was only empty stonework. It didn't add up. He and his comrades had only slain a handful of Githyanki so far. That's when Faunus realized it. The Githyanki were hiding. They were hiding from him. In an adventure where Faunus chose the kindest and most selfless option whenever possible, this feeling was alien. He didn't feel like a friendly bard. He felt ruthless, dangerous, frightening. It was an ugly feeling, an icy prickling that ran through his body in waves. Petting the team's dog, Scratch, before bedding down at camp was a nightly ritual for Faunus. Usually, it was a fun way to end a day of adventure. But the night after the Kresh, Faunus really needed to pet that dog.
Faunus was my virtual avatar, and he inherited some of my fundamental traits. He liked talking about music, he did not like worms in his brain, and he never knew when to shut the fuck up.
It's not the worst trait for a bard. Talking, after all, was one of his most important skills, the ability to persuade, deceive, or flabbergast his way out of a sticky situation. But it's a skill with limitations. Limitations he would eventually find the hard way. Faunus's ally and kind of girlfriend, Shadowheart, was a cleric of Shar, a goddess of darkness and loss. And Shadowheart's personal journey brought her deep into Shar's domain, Shadowfell, where she was meant to complete a brutal ritual and cement herself permanently as one of Shar's most ardent worshippers.
This did not strike Faunus as a particularly good life choice.
Beyond the cruelty of the ritual itself, pledging her loyalty to Shar would condemn Shadowheart to an empty and miserable life, a lonely life of vicious, arbitrary violence. And Faunus knew Shadowheart well enough to know, without a doubt, that she wanted more out of life than to suffer in darkness. So, Faunus followed trusty old Plan A. When the critical moment came, he tried to use his rhetorical prowess to convince Shadowheart to see the light. And he failed miserably.
If I have to step over your corpse to fulfill what Lady Shar asks of me, so be it. Your choice.
In fact, Faunus failed so miserably at talking, the one thing he was supposed to be good at, that when Shadowheart threatened violence, he tried to call her bluff, and they ended up in battle.
I think some folks might not like what I did next. In a story-driven game, my instinct is to let the consequences fall where they may, to let awful things happen and learn to live with them. That's just part of the experience. But my personal exception is when I'm about to lose a major playable character permanently. This is especially true in the Fire Emblem series, where I'll replay an hour-long fight 5 times to make sure I keep everybody alive. So, when Shadowheart turned her spear against me,
I gave the moment a second try. Clearly, Faunus had just chosen the wrong dialogue options. All I needed to do was talk differently, talk better, and this time I could convince Shadowheart to make the right decision. I said different lines, unlocked a skill check, and... fuck.
If I have to step over your corpse to fulfill what Lady Shar asks of me...
Hey Shadowheart, can you cast guidance on me so I can convince you to betray your religion?
I was not about to give up on Shadowheart. I just needed to try everything, try random options, really explore every branch of the dialogue tree. I could even try something stupid, like saying nothing at all. But that actually worked.
For I know you, a lost child, frightened by wolves in the dark.
What did you say?
Through the magical level 9 bard ability of shutting the fuck up, Faunus had given Shadowheart a chance to sort things out for herself. Against all my instincts, keeping quiet was actually working. So when the game gave Faunus another chance to speak, to intervene, to persuade, with a lump in my throat, I stuck to my guns. Faunus kept his mouth shut. In a small way, Faunus was right. Shadowheart didn't truly want to serve Shar. Where Faunus was dead wrong was doubting her, doubting that she could realize what she truly wanted on her own. He wanted to solve the problem himself, use his magical talking powers to make everybody around him see the right answer. But that failed every time. It was stepping back, staying silent, and trusting in his friend that ended up saving everybody's lives. Faunus had to learn the lesson again later on, when his most trustworthy and reliable friend, Karlach, experienced a brutal moment of clarity in which she confronted her own terminal illness. In this moment, once again, Faunus couldn't bear to stay silent, couldn't stand idly by and let his dear friend suffer. He said things as right as he could, as poetic and as true as he could, and everything he said was the exact wrong thing.
What the fuck am I supposed to do now? You do it. I'm tired.
Because the truth is, there was no right thing to say. Not the way Faunus was imagining it, and not the way that I was imagining it. There's no sequence of words, no matter how carefully constructed, that can fix that kind of pain. Tie the terror up in a tidy bow and make everybody happy again. If that's what you're trying to do with your words, you're using them wrong. I'm still trying to learn that lesson. I wonder if anyone can see any of that. You ever have one of those really good phone calls that ends bad? Like, you're having a really long, meaningful conversation with somebody, and the mood is great, and you're laughing, enjoying each other's company and each other's stories, and then, out of left field, out of nowhere, suddenly...
Anyway, bye.
And you sit there, phone in hand, thinking, what just happened? Where did that come from? Why did a good phone call suddenly end bad? Baldur's Gate 3 is a very, very good phone call, and it ends bad.
I'm not going to spoil the content of the ending, the substance. I couldn't, really, because your choices towards the end of Baldur's Gate 3 can radically change the game's closing moments. Even if I showed you my own personal ending in its entirety, unedited, it might bear little resemblance to your ending. But our endings would have one crucial thing in common. They'd be over in the blink of an eye. After a grand adventure spanning 150 hours, you get scarcely more than sentence fragments from your fellow adventurers. It's cartoonishly perfunctory, a sibling in spirit to the old NES games that rewarded completion with white text over a black void reading simply, "Congratulations." It's common knowledge among players that Baldur's Gate 3's ending is, at time of recording, buggy and broken. Many players have reported that allies who died tragically during their journey will pop in to say yo during the ending. That romantic relationships they've been building for weeks seem to vanish from the game's memory. In my own ending, the geometry failed to load in for several minutes, leaving the characters suspended in a blurry yellow void.
But I like glitches and bugs. Brokenness, rough edges, and the happy little aesthetic accidents of a loading error. I cherish that kind of unintentional, organic texture. I like the technological brokenness of the ending of Baldur's Gate 3. What actually irks me, what lingers in the air like a sour note at the end of an otherwise beautiful melody, is the extreme brevity and the jarring tone.
Official PR from Larian is that the ending was kept short to make the game feel more epic. It's a claim that doesn't really parse. When they think epic finale, most people aren't envisioning a short wave goodbye and a hard cut to credits. My hunch, and the hunch of many, is that the ending is simply incomplete, that in the rush to deliver a finished game by external deadlines, the final minutes of Baldur's Gate 3 just didn't get finished. There's no concrete evidence, but it's a decently educated guess. Either way, that's the view from outside the narrative, the perspective that incorporates the financial realities of creating a video game for mass distribution. That's the view when I remember my hands are just clacking keys on a keyboard. If I step back inside the narrative, the ending of Baldur's Gate 3 is just a story beat with a very bizarre, memorable tone. Faunus journeyed with his friends across a continent, across dimensions, staring down death every step of the way. He helped his friends solve the greatest problems of their lives, and they helped him rescue the city he called home. Then, after all that, everybody just quietly and quickly walked away. No fanfare, no waterworks. The mission was done, and everybody had lives to get back to. They didn't need to say goodbye, they could just text it later, and that would probably be enough. Anyway, bye. No real epilogue, no opportunity to reflect. The bad guys are dead, the world is saved, and the time has come to roll credits and move on. It's an impolite denial of the impact of everything that preceded it, the scissors of anticlimax quietly snipping free a metric ton of emotional weight.
I don't like it. I think I kind of hate it, in fact, but the effect is really interesting to me.
Playable epilogues give us a chance to process a story from inside that story. Before our eyes have to readjust to the light of reality, the fictional characters we've spent so much time with join us in a conversation about what we've just experienced. Without that kind of epilogue, it's like Baldur's Gate 3 is harshly ejecting me from the narrative, forcing me to do my reflecting in the real world instead. In hindsight, from outside the narrative, is Astarion really a damaged but charming rascal, or is he just an insufferable edgelord with good cheekbones? It's neat that legacy characters like Jaheira and Minsk made appearances, but does it overindulge nostalgia to make them playable characters? Because Baldur's Gate 3 doesn't have a real epilogue, I don't get a chance to consider those questions around a campfire with my comrades. I have to consider them sitting in my busted chair, listening to the birds chirping outside my window. Are my evaluations in the busted chair colder, more detached, less human? Or are they clearer, more precise, less skewed by artificial narrative pathos? I'm a different person inside the narrative of Baldur's Gate 3 than I am outside of it. Which version of myself should I trust to evaluate the game? Right now, in this kind of busted version, Baldur's Gate 3's ending forces me to reckon with that question.
I just said a whole lot of words about the value of the game's broken ending. But do you want to know the truth? I'm still holding on to my save file, the one from right before the ending. And the moment that Larian releases an upgraded ending with a full epilogue, I'm going to load that save back up and give Faunus a proper finale. And I think that little save file on my hard drive is proof. Proof that the journey mattered to me, and proof that the ending, as it currently exists, really did hurt.
I am not Faunus. Faunus was a real sweetie. I just try to be. Faunus endured grievous injuries. I struggle with the common cold. But the biggest difference between my virtual avatar and me is that unlike Faunus, I don't have a single musical bone in my body. All of that went straight to my sister. I could probably write a melody if I really put my back into it, but if I attempted to sing on the internet, I would be dragged before The Hague for crimes against humanity. Except I won't. I'm an American citizen. This is a tangent. The point is I can't sing. So I can't sing you the song that Faunus wrote at the end of his journey, after all of his friends had quietly walked away. What I can do is read you the lyrics. Come raise a glass of Baldur's grape to the worm-infested band, or, if you're light about the purse, a pint of grog will do. Waylaid in hell, then spat back out, our quest dimensions spanned. The path through shade and shadow fell, yet still we saw it through. We left great heaps of blood and gore in dungeons manifold. The blood was ours, the gore was theirs, on days when fortune smiled. Short work we made of tyrants tall and necromancers old. Few cultists did we leave unslain, few corpses undefiled. The poorest souls and truest folk we pledged ourselves to save. We couldn't save them to a man, though Mistra knows we tried. But aches and pains and lifelong scars give proof to all we gave. And if we must yet bear some shame, we'll bear that shame with pride. T-pose statue. T-pose statue. Thank you for watching this video. Believe it or not, when I was done with Baldur's Gate 3, I didn't know if I was going to have anything to say about it, and once I sat down to write, I found out that I sure did have some things to say. There's all sorts of goodies in the description below. There's a music list, credits for footage capture, sources are cited, and I want to give special thanks this time to two modders, Urshan and Etherpoint. They did the camera tweaks and the UI tweaks that I used respectively to capture a lot of the footage that I used in the video. My next handful of videos are going to be a mini-series about finishing games that I left behind years ago, games that I set aside and abandoned, and the unique perspectives that you get when you play part of a game when you're a kid and the rest of the game when you're a grown-up. Our good dear friend Link is going to show up, although probably not in one of the games you're imagining. But first, I'm going to tackle Blasto. God help me. So, until then, money is fake, arm the homeless.